Welcome, everyone, to the Writing for Your Life online conference entitled Author Platform Development Through Social Media. My name is Brian Elaine, and I produce the Writing for Your Life webinars and in-person conferences, and I'm also honored to serve as the director of the Frederick Buechner Center. Today's webinar is entitled How to Build Your Own Podcast Program. I'm glad to welcome Mike McHargue, also known as Science Mark. If you would like to ask a question, please type them into the chat box on the right-hand side, and we'll get them to the end of the presentation. Let me turn it over to Mike. Mike, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here and glad to talk to everyone today about podcasting. We're going to cover a lot in the next 45 minutes with some Q&A to follow, and I just want you to know that there's more than we could possibly cover in just an hour about podcasting. So you'll get a copy of this presentation following the event. So don't worry about trying to capture everything you see with notes, because we'll send you the slides, which will include a step-by-step, beginning to end process of how to set up a podcast, from every step, from planning to recording to posting, to a strategy for getting the most possible listeners with the resources you have. So we're talking today about how to build your podcast platform, and I'll be switching back and forth between the slides, which explain the process, and then some demonstrations here with my webcam. So I'm going to switch over to the slides now and get started. So we're talking about how to build a podcast, and I have some experience with this because I launched and host two very popular podcasts. One's called Ask Science Mike, and the other's called the Liturgist Podcast. And Ask Science Mike is good for 350 to 550,000 downloads per episode, and the Liturgist Podcast gets over 1 million downloads a month. This is starting from zero about 2 years ago. So podcasting has the potential to give you a big platform if you figure out how to say something resonant with your audience. And that means I love podcasting. You know, podcasting is incredibly intimate. It creates a relationship between you and your audience. You're in their ears on a regular basis. And because of that, they feel like they know you more than most other forms of media. I like podcasting because it gives me total control over how and when I communicate with my audience. And in my case, that let me, as a first-time author, have the #1 selling science and faith book in the country with my very first book. It also let me have a sold-out book tour. I actually sold tickets to my book tour, and we sold out most stops because my audience knew that I was coming, because they hear me via a podcast. So if you have a speaking component to your author platform, you're going to benefit by having a podcast because it makes it easier to promote your speaking events in local audiences. But maybe even more than that, I love podcasting because people really pay attention when they listen to a podcast. When people read blogs, they skim. Social media is a torrent of information. And even when people watch long form video and YouTube, they tend to skip around. But podcast listeners listen to your entire show without skipping and without you having to compete with other media, which might be unique in the world of media today. But if you've got to think about one thing first when it comes to podcasting, and the question is, should you podcast at all? Because here's the thing, podcasting is not for every author. I would kind of ask myself, do I like public speaking? Because many authors I've noticed love to write. They don't like to share verbally as much. And podcasting is all about talking and talking and talking and being comfortable listening to the sound of your own voice. So that's going to be a factor in deciding if podcasting is something you want to do. You also want to decide, do you have any recording experience? Because the fact is, to record a podcast, you're basically making a very simple record. You're going through the process of recording tracks, editing, exporting, and it does require some technical knowledge. And the more you have, the easier podcasting will be for you. You've also got to decide how much web design experience you have, because intrinsic to the medium is the fact that podcasts are delivered via web technologies like HTTP and RSS. You want to decide how much time you have to devote to podcasting. Depending on how much production values, how much pre-production, how much scripting you use, it actually can take a lot of time to create a podcast. An average episode of Ask Science Mike involves probably 15 or 20 man hours of time, which is a show I do weekly. And the Liturgist podcast probably takes 80 to 100 hours per episode that gets released. And that's a lot of time commitment that actually takes a large team. You want to decide if you're going to have guests or if it will just be you, because when you add guests, you add complexity in terms of how you record and how you edit. But more important than all of those things, which are kind of screener questions, you need to know who is your audience and what is it that you have to tell them. And the better you do answering these questions clearly, the easier it will be to grow your podcast. So I can tell you off the top of my head that the audience for my show, Ask Science Mike, is the spiritually homeless and frustrated. And the core message of that program is that all questions are allowed. See how simple that is? It's branding. And the more work you do to figure out exactly who your audience is and what the core idea of your podcast is, the more it will catch on with the audience and the easier it will be for you to produce the program, because you have a litmus test for deciding what makes it on the show and what does not. Now, once you know who you're talking to and what you're going to say, you need to decide how often you're going to say it. There's a lot of options for podcast frequency. Some podcasts are daily, and of course, that's a very large time commitment. Others come out on a weekly basis, every other week, or even monthly. And one thing you can consider when you think about the slog and the grind of producing a podcast, where as soon as you finish one episode, you have to start another, is many podcasts choose for that reason to work with a seasonal approach. So just like television shows are produced in seasons, you're seeing more and more podcasts today that are also produced in seasons, which lets you take a break to measure how well things are going, to make adjustments, and to get more content loaded into your production system so that you're not constantly on a treadmill trying to get your next show out. So we're going to figure out who we're talking to, what we have to tell them, and how often the show will come out. And once we know those things, we can actually start to set up a podcast. And you can see here's a picture. That's not my home studio. That's a home studio I found that was royalty free on the internet. But the thing I want you to notice from that photograph, there's a lot of gear. There's a lot of stuff required. You see a microphone here with a pop filter. You see a computer. You see some editing software. You see an audio interface. This is kind of the bare minimum required to create a podcast. And let's kind of look at an overview of the process that comes with creating a podcast from scratch. You've got to start by deciding on the name of your program and the format. When I say format, I mean how often is it you plus guests? What do you envision in terms of production values? Will you have music? Will you not have music? Will it be edited, or will it just be a completely unedited episode that comes up? And you can see kind of different approaches. If you listen to Radiolab or a lot of NPR programs, those are heavily scripted, edited productions. But if you listen to something like You Made It Weird with Pete Holmes or the Robcast by Rob Bell, you'll hear podcasts that are much more informal and very stream of conscious. Either approach can work, but it needs to be an intentional choice that you stick with over the life of your program. So you've got a name and a format. Next, you'll need to create cover art and metadata. Now, metadata is a technical term that just means data about data or information about information. It means you have to have some things written out before you go to create your podcast to submit it to the stores that distribute podcasts. You'll need to set up hosting for your podcast. Your feed and your files have to live somewhere. We'll talk more about all these steps throughout the presentation. You've got to submit your podcast to iTunes and other listing and podcast curating services. You'll need to record an episode, edit that episode, post it online, promote it, and that's key. You want to check your analytics to see how the show is doing, and then go back to step 5 and repeat over and over and over. I really want to emphasize that creating a podcast is a significant time commitment. Now, when you're going to start a show, welcome to what? You've got to name your program something. Your name, you want to consider Google and search value. You want to consider your brand and making sure people understand in some way this podcast is connected with you. If you're using it to promote your author platform, you've got to have a brief description of about 500 characters or less. And this is incredibly important because of search. People find podcasts using the search engine in iTunes and Google primarily. And so you want good keywords that will help people discover your program. Your podcast will need a subtitle that's shorter than the brief description, a summary, which can be longer than 500 characters, and you need to pick a category. What category does your podcast exist in? And that's going to be really important because iTunes lists out categories with rankings. So if you go into a very crowded category, it can be harder to break into the top charts, which is important for how people find podcasts that haven't heard of you before. You also need really great cover art, and this is incredibly vital. This is the image people see when they look for your podcast in iTunes and other listing services. That file has to be a PNG or JPEG file that's perfectly square and 2048 by 2048 pixels. You want to make sure you look at your design in resolutions as small as 128 by 128 because it will get shrunk down in different previews on different applications. And you want to look at other shows that are in the top 200 in the category you choose. What do you see that stands out already? What could you do that mimics the best people in your category but still does something different? So you want to look at what's working today and then what you could do that's different. If you look at the Liturgist podcast, we have this really bright salmon, red, solid color behind simple text. And the reason we did that is that color isn't used much in our category, and it makes us stand out in the visual listing. So your cover art is incredibly important. If you don't have design experience, you want to ask a friend who's a designer or hire a designer to make great cover art for your program. And remember, one option is to use a photograph of yourself with logo type. People like to see smiling faces on iTunes. Now, once you have your metadata and title and you have your cover art, now you've got to set up a podcast host. And there's a couple of different options in podcast hosting. Probably the easiest thing to do is to use WordPress, Squarespace, or another CMS that's a content management system host. These are the kind of people that host blogs. And since many authors have blogs, they're already familiar with designing websites that way. And this has got several advantages. It lets you use a single interface to manage your podcast, your blog, and your website. That's nice. That's easy. It's also a single fee for all of your own media. So if you're on Squarespace or a hosted WordPress blog, you don't have to pay any extra beyond your blog to also host a podcast. But it's kind of complex. You're going to be setting up 2 distinct feeds on a single host. And the analytics you get from a blog platform, the way you can measure downloads and listeners, doesn't work nearly as well on blog hosts as it does on dedicated podcast hosts. It can be fragile or finicky. When you have issues with your feed, your blog host provider doesn't have the technical support or expertise to resolve issues. So you could have a situation where you've had a podcast that's been out for a year that suddenly stops updating, and your new episodes aren't available to listeners, and your blog host might not be able to help you. And this last point is important because you may find your podcast host gets upset when you have a lot of listeners, because there's more bandwidth than they plan for hosting a blog, even if they claim to offer unlimited data bandwidth. So you don't want people frustrated because it takes too long to download your show. So the option I prefer is to use a dedicated podcast host. This means a company that only hosts podcasts and does nothing else. There's several. There's Libsyn, Blueberry, and Podbean. Podbean's my favorite. They're probably the third most popular in the space, but I find them incredibly easy to use. And Ask Science Mike and the Liturgist podcast are both hosted on Podbean. So Libsyn and Blueberry are the most popular, and Podbean I like because it's so easy to use compared to the other two, and very inexpensive. I found that even with episodes that get more than 1 million downloads, no one complains about performance with Podbean or Libsyn or Blueberry. They're great at what they do. The cost is very reasonable. You can get a podcast hosting plan for as little as $8 a month. That's a really great cost for what you're getting in terms of owned media. And the analytics from a dedicated podcast host are great, which is essential if you ever want to have sponsors on your podcast. Sponsors want to know exactly how many feed hits you get. They want to know exactly how many downloads you get per episode. And that information can be difficult or impossible to find on a blog host, but is simple and readily apparent with a podcast host. Now, the only thing that can be difficult about having a separate podcast host from your blog is there can be a little bit more complexity integrating your podcast into your existing website. That can take some technical expertise. There are ways around it. And that, maybe if we can cover that in the Q&A if someone is curious, because that would take a few minutes to go through and explain. So after you've got your host set up and you've gone through and created an account and filled out all the information, now you have to submit your show to iTunes. Now, why is iTunes so important? Why do I keep saying iTunes, 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 iTunes? For every podcast in the world, iTunes is by far the most important directory. It's not even close. Google Play, Stitcher, all the other players in the space typically make up less than 10% of the podcast audience. In fact, some of the most popular podcasts about Android phones, more than half of their listeners come from iTunes. So the iPhone, the iPad, and iTunes make up the vast majority of podcast listeners. So you've got to have an Apple ID in order to get your podcast into iTunes. Now, this will not be shared as part of publishing. No one will get your email address, but you've got to have iTunes installed on a PC or a Mac to do this. You can't do it from a mobile device today. So once you get iTunes installed, you can see when you go into the iTunes store and click on podcasts, on the right-hand side of the screen, there's a little option to submit a podcast. That will take you through a wizard that asks some questions. As long as you've gone ahead and written out the metadata I talked about earlier, you can just copy and paste into those forms. You submit it to Apple, and then they'll turn around and approve it. In the past, that's taken as long as 4 weeks. These days, it usually takes a few days. Now, once you have your show submitted to iTunes, you've got to know how you're going to share it out to the world. And there's a couple of different ways that people access podcasts. One is with the web. So if you go to AskScienceMike.com, you can listen to my podcast in your web browser. And that's the way people typically share podcasts, is with web links. But RSS, which stands for Really Simple Syndication, is how subscribers access your program. So when iTunes and Google Play and Stitcher and other podcast directories look at your program, they do so via RSS. You don't really need to know what RSS is. You just need to know that basically means listen to the podcast with an app. And there's a ton of different curators and players out there. And as I said, Apple is by far the most used on all fronts. And you can have different web and RSS hosts for your podcast, or you can use the same host. So Squarespace hosts my podcast website, and Podbean hosts the RSS feed and files for my podcast. That's a little more technically complicated, but it gives you a lot of flexibility. Here's what that looks like. You can see on the left is AskScienceMike.com. It looks like a website. I can put advertising there. I can include whatever content and language I want to include. I have total control over the entire presentation. On the right, you see an RSS feed as it appears in iTunes and the iTunes Store. And what I want to point out about RSS and players, you have less control over what people see in RSS than you do via the web, which is why I like to have two different websites. So on the left is Squarespace, on the right is what people see through Podbean and a third-party application. So let's talk a little bit about recording. And I think if you're new to podcasting, we'll spend significant time here because this is where an in-person demonstration is going to give you the most value versus things you can find on Google later. If you're new to podcasting, try to keep your format very simple. A spoken word program that's not overly produced is going to be a lot easier to record and deliver. If you don't have a lot of time, keep your format simple. So even if you know a lot about recording, understand that every sound effect, every bit of editing you do, is going to dramatically increase the amount of time you have to spend producing the program. In my experience, the Liturgist podcast takes 2 to 5 times as many man hours per hour of released audio as the show Ask Science Mike, because this is a much more elaborate production. This is what I'm saying. It can exponentially influence the amount of time it takes to create your show. But even Ask Science Mike is pretty elaborate in terms of production compared to most podcasts. There's a theme song, there's a vamp with music, there's audio cues that happen in between the questions, there's an outro, and all those things, if you're new to recording, are going to be very difficult to pull off. Now, you'll also need equipment in order to record. There's a few options. There's things called field recorders, which are completely self-contained. There are USB microphones that are really easy ways to get audio directly into your computer that sounds great. Or you can use a traditional XLR, that's a studio microphone standard with an audio interface that has preamps, which are preamplifiers. They're how you adjust the volume of a traditional microphone. That's a really flexible setup that has the best sound quality, but is also probably the most expensive way to go. So let's unpack these categories a little bit, and then I'll visually show you what these options are. With field recorders, they're a great option if you are brand new to recording because they're completely self-contained and you don't have to learn any software to use them. They're very portable, and you record on the field recorder and then copy the recording onto your computer for editing. Your computer is not involved at all in the recording process, and that's especially helpful if you have an older computer that could struggle to record audio in real time. Now, the bad thing about field recorders is it's really tough to do multiple takes or punch in recordings. If you say the wrong word and want to go back and change it, it's very hard to do on a field recorder, but pretty easy to do on your computer. Now, if instead you're going to record on your computer, and that's something you feel comfortable trying, you're going to need a mic and an audio interface to get the signal into the computer. But USB microphones have an audio interface built in. So that's just one device you plug into the computer and start recording. Adobe Audition and Pro Tools are the standards in audio production, but GarageBand is really easy and is included with Macs for free. So if you're on Windows, you'll probably want to go with Adobe Audition or Pro Tools. If you're on a Mac, you could start with GarageBand, and then if you outgrow it, you could try Adobe Audition or Pro Tools. No matter what you choose, expect a learning curve. This is a career people do recording and editing audio. So understand it's not going to be an instant upstart. You're going to have to probably watch some tutorials on YouTube and learn how to use this software. And you want to make sure whatever you go with, real-time monitoring is absolutely critical to getting good sound. So as I'm talking to you right now, I'm wearing headphones, and I can hear the audio from my microphone fed back into my headphones with no delay. And that lets me know how to move the microphone to get the best sound. It lets me test my recording as I make it. That's really important. Now, in terms of USB microphones, there's a few options. Some people use headsets. I don't recommend them. The sound, although fine for a web conference, simply isn't good enough for a podcast. Podcast listeners are very discerning about sound quality. And if you have bad sound quality, it's going to make it hard for your program to grow. Two of the most popular USB mics are the Blue Snowball and Snowflake. They're good options, but they tend to create a lot of room tone, but they're very inexpensive. A step up from that would be the Yeti Pro, which is a great microphone that's got built-in gain control, built-in headphone amp, really good option. And then Audio-Technica's ATR 2100, I think, is probably the best sounding USB mic for the money available. And we'll come back and I'm going to show you a USB mic so that you'll know what that looks like. Then one step up from there, to get an audio interface plus a microphone. And in terms of audio interfaces, I really like the brands Focusrite and Tascam. They offer great sound. They're not very expensive. You know, if you were making a record, a lot of people probably wouldn't say to get Tascam preamps, but you know, you can get a 2-channel or 4-channel Tascam audio interface for about $100. And you can get something like an 8-channel, which would have more channels than you would need to record even a very elaborate program with a lot of guests, for less than $200. Focusrite's a little bit of a step up. I'm using a Focusrite preamp right now, but still very, very affordable. And again, inexpensive, but they sound great. Get an interface that has the number of channels you think you'll ever need. So if it's just going to be you, a 2-channel interface is fine. If you're going to do interviews that are you with one other person, or if you have a co-host, 2 channels is great. If you think you might end up recording guests, I do recommend a 4 or 8-channel preamp. We'll talk more about that in a second. Now, there are 2 types of microphones. There's dynamic mics and condenser mics. Dynamic mics are really tough and rugged and sturdy, and they tend to be easy to work with if you're new. Condenser mics can have a crisper sound, but they're not very forgiving to beginners. So I usually say, if you're going to get a dedicated microphone and you're new, go with a dynamic mic. And again, in a second, we're going to switch over to video, and I'll show you exactly what I mean. The SM7B is my all-time favorite dynamic mic. It's about $300. So it's a big investment, but I'll show you why I love it in just a second. Shure's SM58 and Beta 58 both have great reputations. The SM58 is very inexpensive, can be had for less than $100. And the Beta 58 is an incredibly crisp sound that still sounds good in less than ideal rooms. All right, so I'm going to switch back to my my webcam here, and we'll show you some actual microphone options. So I mentioned USB headsets. This is a USB headset. It looks like a set of headphones that has a microphone in it. These tend to be very, very inexpensive microphones, and it will sound kind of like a telephone call, which is not a good option for podcasting. But I mentioned field recorders, and these are a great choice. This is a famous one, the Zoom H1. You can see it has microphones built in, and it's got a record button and power. It's literally so easy to record the field recorder. You can turn it on, press record, and start talking, and you're recording. It couldn't be easier. That's a great option. When you're done, it's got a USB port that you can plug into your computer, and it will act kind of like a thumb drive to let you download your audio, or it has a memory card you can pull out and put into a card reader. These are a great option. Now, this is a very, very inexpensive field recorder. You could step up a little bit higher in the product line with something like this. And this is going to give you like a really great studio quality recording. It's a Zoom H2N, and it's got dedicated mic gain. And I've used this to record my show, and people can't tell that I'm using a field recorder. So great option for travel. You see how small, how light, how easy to use. If we talk instead about a USB mic, this is Blue's Yeti Pro, which I love. You can see it's got dedicated gain control for how loud the mic is. You can see it's got a headphone jack on the bottom and then a USB plug. So you plug this into your computer, and this is an entire recording studio. It's also got an XLR out. So you can use this with a mixer or an audio interface as you grow. Incredibly useful option with the Yeti Pro. Now, what I don't like about the Yeti Pro and mini mics is you see if I set it down on my desk, I've got to lean way down to use it. You want a mic pretty close to your mouth, and a lot of these desk stands aren't ideal. I actually take it off the stand and put it on a mic stand to use it. This is the Shure SM58. You can see it just looks like when you like imagine a microphone, this is the exact kind of microphone you picture. This has a great sound, and if you're in a room that has a lot of echo, if you hold this mic close to your mouth, it's going to give you a consistently good sound. If someone's mowing the lawn outside, if the kids are playing 2 rooms over, you can still get a podcast done with this microphone. But the mic I love, my favorite mic, is this. This is the Shure SM7B. You can see it looks like it comes from a radio station because it does. This is the most popular broadcast microphone in the world, and I like to use it with a telescoping spring-loaded radio stand because with a normal mic stand, you have all these dials. You have to twist and adjust to try to get the mic positioned like you want it. But this mic, wherever I put it, it just stays. It's super, super convenient, super easy to use. Now, it's not just a matter of which microphone you use. It also matters what your microphone technique is. And in fact, your microphone technique is more important than the microphone you select. Now, you'll notice what I'm doing is I have a microphone off to the side instead of straight in front of my mouth, about 2 fingers away from my mouth, and that's a really great position to get good sound. Here's why. If you talk directly into a microphone, it gets really muffled, and you can get really bad pops. Now, this mic has got an incredible pop filter, so even talking straight into it, you don't get the pop, pop, pop. But a normal microphone used like this really sounds terrible. And remember I said I don't like desk stands. Here's why. How do I sound now? Can you hear a difference in my voice? I sound more distant. There's more of an echo. And if there was noise around me, that would be a real problem. So I like to keep the mic close, get that good radio sound, and a good radio mic stand helps with that positioning. It's also helpful as you record to always, always, always use headphones. You want to hear yourself talking so that you know exactly where the mic gets the best sound. And you don't want any echo from your audio coming back into the microphone because it'll sound really bad to your listeners. And you also want to make sure that as you're recording, you minimize noise. So I have a fan in this room for when it gets hot. I never have it turned on when I record. I make sure that I turn off anything in the room that has fans because that white noise from computer fans and air conditioners can all show up in your audio and really, really make it sound bad. And then positioning, again, 2 to 4 fingers away from your mouth and then off access to one of the sides. You can kind of play around with moving the mic up, which gives you more of a chest tone, or moving it down, which gives you more of a nose tone. I like to sit neutral in the middle, but I also have a pretty good natural radio voice. You might find you need to play around with mic positioning to get the best sound. So let me switch back to our presentation. Okay. So again, just to review really quick, your microphone technique is more important than your actual microphone. When you are recording, always wear headphones. Make sure you use a pop filter and a shock mount. In the mic I was just using, the shock mount and pop filter are both built in. But if your mic doesn't have a pop filter or shock mount built in, make sure you buy one and use it. It makes a huge difference in your sound. Minimize noise in the room, including white noise like computer fans, air conditioners, and other devices. And make sure you focus a lot on how your microphone is positioned. And remember the rule of two to four fingers off axis for a great sound. Now, if you decide on your podcast you're going to have guests, understand that it is much easier to have guests in person because all you need is multiple microphones and an audio interface with enough channels. You can hit record, everything happens at the same time. When you want to have guests in other places, that's much, much more difficult, but possible. So here's a couple of options. There's some software called Call Recorder that will let you record a Skype call, both sides, and then grab the audio from it. It's really easy to use, but it can have artifacts. If there's problems with someone's Wi-Fi or their internet bandwidth, you get these drops and these almost burp sounding audio compression, audio effects that are very unpleasant for the audience and can make it hard for people to understand what someone's saying. And it also means your guest's familiarity with mic positioning affects the quality of your program. Another option that I found to work really well is actually to mail your guests a field recorder, right? If you buy a couple of field recorders, $90 each, you can literally UPS them or postal mail them to your guest. They can record, then ship it back. Now you've got great audio. And if you record other podcasters, which is always a good option, they'll be skilled enough to record their own audio and send it to you. Okay, so that's some ideas about recording both yourself and recording guests. After you record, you've got to take your MP3 file or your recording file and bounce or export to an MP3 file. MP3 is the only type of file you should consider for your podcast. And I usually create a 128K stereo file, which will be an option in whatever software you're using. You've got to make sure you tag the MP3. And I'll talk about that in just a moment. And then remember also to create show notes. Whatever you talk about in your program, write a few paragraphs about it and put that on your website, put that in your iTunes summary, because it will help Google send new listeners to you and also gives you a reason to send listeners to your website. So if I talk about a scientific study or I talk about a book on my program, I let my listeners know they can go click a link in the show notes on the website, and that lets me send them into my website, which might have an email capture strategy, might just have links to my other work and speaking, and in general, it lets me get more value out of the podcast listener. So I mentioned tagging. This is what that looks like. You take your file and you've got to put information in the file itself about the show before you put it on your web host. So you can see I've got a title here. I've got an artist. So the title was the name of that episode. The artist is the name of the program. I always set the genre as podcast. I set the year as the year the show was recorded. And in the comment, I put my website. Why? If someone clicks on the file in iTunes, they have a clickable link that goes directly to my website. This is what that looks like in a web execution. Same episode. You can see here, I have more control over the layout. So I can tell people about an upcoming tour. I've got my show notes. That's what I'm showing you here, are show notes with clickable links. But then you notice on the right, I can run ads for my own stuff on my website. So I've got a little ad for my book. I've got an ad for these together groups, which are something I do as part of the podcast. And then I've got a Patreon button so people can donate money to my podcast if they like it. And that's a significant portion of my income is people who've decided to support my podcast on Patreon. But notice I don't have the ability to include a Patreon link in iTunes and other podcast platforms. Show notes help get people to my website where I can decide exactly what I want them to see. I think it's important, especially if you're new to podcasting, to record a practice episode or 2 or 3 episodes you have no intention of releasing. You just want to get used to the process of speaking into a microphone, editing, trying to figure out how the format will work. There's nothing wrong with recording episodes you never release. But once you've gotten to the point through practice that you have a program you would like to share, don't share it until you have planned how to get the word out about the program. Why do I say don't post until you have a plan? Because the first 6 weeks are the most important of any time period in your podcast history. Once your show appears on iTunes, it's eligible for iTunes New and Noteworthy, but only for 6 weeks. And in order to get on New and Noteworthy in iTunes, as compared to your category, you need to have great growth in new subscribers. You need to have subscribers that stay active and continue to download your program. And you need people to rate your podcast, ideally 4 or 5 stars in the iTunes store. And you've got to have a plan to sustain that activity for 6 full weeks. This is the time when you call in every favor, every friendship, and every family member in your life to get your podcast off the ground. To tell you in my own life, when I launched Ask Science Mike, I was very lucky. I launched with 3,500 subscribers at the very first episode. And because it grew, I was in New and Noteworthy for the entire 6 weeks that my podcast came out. And by the end of that 6-week period, I had 125,000 subscribers, about half of which had never heard of me before. So it's a huge, huge deal to get into New and Noteworthy on iTunes. And again, only possible for the first 6 weeks of your program. Now, how do I know how many subscribers I have? Because I measure my success using podcast analytics. And I want to be really clear here. To some degree, as a person who worked in digital advertising for many years, podcast analytics are almost fictional. And here's why. One of the metrics is feed hits, but that's just a measure of how many times your RSS feed is accessed. And that could be a mixture of actual clients, people really checking your feed, and cloud services like iTunes, where thousands of servers can be scanning your feed for updates. And that can make your analytics think you have a lot more subscribers than you actually do. But even looking at unique hits can be misleading, because what happens if you have a listener who has an iPhone with 3 podcast apps on it, plus a computer, plus an iPad? That one person can look like 8 or 10 subscribers. So I always want to be very clear that feed hits don't necessarily translate directly to subscribers. Probably a more useful metric is the number of downloads you get. But again, a lot of people download to more than one device or more than once per device. And we have no way of knowing if a downloaded podcast ever actually gets played. Can you believe that? There's no way to tell how many of those downloads are actual plays. And even if someone, does play the file, they might not play the whole thing. But even with all those caveats and limitations, I still track my analytics and I look at those numbers regularly for 2 reasons. One, I get a location of where the downloads are coming from. That lets me know exactly where in the world people are listening to my program. That helps me plan marketing for my writing, helps me plan marketing for my events. So that's an incredibly useful piece of information to have. And the other thing I look for in my podcast analytics is how we trend over time. I don't actually care how many downloads I get in a given week or how many feed hits. What I care is over time that my feed subscribers and my downloads are increasing. That's a sign of a healthy podcast. So I know that has been an absolute whirlwind, but I did get us done in exactly 45 minutes. And so we'll have plenty of time if there's anything specific you'd like to cover in terms of questions.
Well, that was just amazing, Mike. Talk about a core dump of information that was really, really useful. And I think, at least from my own perspective, very insightful. You've obviously learned the ropes, and it shows. And, for us newbies that don't have the kind of experience, I think it was quite enlightening.
Thank you.
So there's a question from Mike Burkhardt, who's not as familiar, I think, with your career track. So you want to talk a little bit about the relationship between your podcasting experience and your authorship from a book perspective?
Oh, that's a great question. I actually, I'm new to the writing world. My first book came out in September, and I consider myself a speaker who writes, not a writer who speaks. And because of that, podcasting is a really natural for me. I also used to own a recording studio and have many years of recording experience. So podcasting was a very natural progression for my career. And honestly, writing, they say today that a publishing platform is critical in getting book deals and getting books to sell. And my author career is an outgrowth of my career as a successful podcaster. I was already making my living with podcasting and speaking before my book came out. So I guess compared to many authors, I've kind of gone backwards. But I think that's really instructive because for people who write, maybe you write for different publications, maybe you submit writing pieces to journals or short stories or whatever you're doing. A podcast will give you the ability to own your audience, to have a direct relationship with potential customers, and it's probably, I think, the most organic, congruent platform to grow a author platform and publishing presence. Now, I will say one thing we've noticed that I've been talking to my publisher about: the mix of audiobooks to traditional hardcovers does get skewed when you start with a podcasting audience. My book did great, but my audiobook did phenomenally well. And the mix of audiobook and Audible downloads compared to Kindle and hardback was pretty historic for my publisher, which means you also need to be very intentional in your book planning strategy about an audiobook strategy, because many of your podcast audience will choose to continue to hear your voice.
Well, thank you, Mike. I knew that myself, but I'm sure that many of the people in our audience didn't realize that you podcasted for quite some time before you came out with your first book.
Yeah.
So Sarah's got a great question in terms of sponsors and advertisers. Can you tell us a little bit about how their ads are inserted? I know you mentioned your website is one location. I imagine within the audio thread of your podcast itself is another location, but can you talk about what that looks like in terms of form, and what it looks like in terms of economics, and what it looks in terms of recruitment?
Yeah, so podcast advertising is a booming industry. Now they're looking for several things in potential shows before they'll really consider you. They want you to be at a consistent 25,000 downloads per episode, generally, to even consider you for a sponsorship deal. But what they love is podcast ads happen in the voice of that podcast. So they don't send you an audio file to put in the program. They send you talking points, and then you discuss a product or service in a allotted amount of time. Most podcast advertising typically consists of combination of pre-roll, which is something you say before your program starts, and then mid-roll, which can be 30 seconds or a minute in the middle of your program where you go into detail about that product or service. CPM rates vary, but both Blueberry and Libsyn and Podbean all have their own advertiser networks. And then Midroll is another company that has a network where they broker between advertisers and podcasters. And those services are great options if you have enough downloads. I've had offers from all the major ad networks. Typically, when I've done sponsorships so far, I've done a direct relationship where a sponsor has approached me and we've agreed to usually a per episode fee for inclusion on the program. In general, I prefer to do listener support because if I'm going to be beholden to an audience, I want it to be the audience that listens to the program. But I have on occasion taken on a sponsor that I felt offered a product that would actually be valuable to my audience. Your credibility is key here. Now, once you have the download numbers of at least 25,000 downloads per episode, even just going through a podcast network, it can be decent income. You can, if you do a weekly program, you could probably make pretty easily $20,000 or $30,000 a year with your podcast. As you grow, you can make much more. But you've got to remember, most podcasts have less than 5,000 subscribers, so it is a relatively difficult threshold to cross once you do those sponsorship deals are there and are well established. CPM rates are pretty consistent. You can actually go to the Midroll Advertising Network's website, and they have an estimator where you can see how many sponsors you would take on, what your listenership is, and they can estimate how much money you could make. I will tell you that calculator tends to be a little optimistic compared to what actual market rates are because it's a lead gen tool. They want you to fill out a form so they can sell you on being a partner to their advertising network. But it's a good option, and it most people, you're not going to get rich off podcasting, but it can become a portion of your income. And I would frankly say that as a person with a business background, multiple streams of revenue making up your income are smart. So if you kind of look at a business model of being an author, if you're completely dependent on book royalties, there can be a lot of instability there. And podcasting and speaking can come in and supplement your book royalties. And that way, if any one thing is not performing as well as it should, you're not wholly dependent on it. So I like to look at podcasting as a great supplemental income opportunity. If you end up having, one of the top 100, top 200 shows on iTunes total, sure, you can make a great living at it.
So let me just state something that I think has been an implicit assumption that we're all making, which is that you're not charging for your podcasts per se. Is that correct?
I don't, but you can, and many shows do have a premium option for listeners where you have to pay to get access to either extra episodes, which the Liturgist podcast has a subscriber-only podcast that's not available to the public, or some shows will have their episodes available for free for a limited amount of time, but then you have to pay to get the full archive. The thing you want to understand, though, is you've got to build an audience before you make a switch like that. If you start there, it can be hard to grow the show.
So meaning that to start your podcast program, it should be free, period.
Yes.
And then you could consider the premium options if there's sufficient success and demand for that.
Yeah, we launched the Liturgist. We ended up launching our Patreon program after we made 500,000 subscribers.
Wow. Okay. And so the Patreon program is just, volunteer contributions, like a donation, more or less.
Yeah, it's a monthly donation that's completely voluntary. Yeah.
Okay. Good. Well, that I think clears up in my mind, at least, some of the economics of, the different aspects of this, and it's good to know how you've approached it and how the market approaches it.
Yeah.
So Sarah asks, how far in advance do you plan your episodes, and particularly in terms of booking guests?
Okay. Ask Science Mike is, I don't have guests on that show generally. So it's a more predictable process. I'm usually the episode you hear was recorded the week before and planned the week before that, and it's a constant rolling process. The Liturgist podcast, which is very, very complicated and has multiple guests per episode, we usually have 18 to 20 episodes in flight at any one time. And it can be as long as 7 or 9 months in advance planning from the conception of an episode to when the world hears it. But we're targeting an NPR level production, and so that would be an exceptionally long production process. But I mean, if you hear our show and you look at our download numbers, you can see that that level of devotion does pay dividends. But I think it's a time investment that most people aren't willing to and probably shouldn't make. But you do want to figure out as you build your program how you document its process. And actually, I don't mind sharing this real quick. I'll let you in behind the curtain on Ask Science Mike and literally show you how the show is planned, if that's okay.
Sure, go ahead.
So I use a system called Trello. And sorry, I'm just gonna get my screen share to pop up here. And this is Trello. And you can see the state of different shows that are in production right now. So I usually have a few weeks planned out. There's pre-production steps, production, and post-production. Different people assigned to roles with due dates, which lets me pop over here and I can see the calendar of when everything's due for every episode coming up in the future. So you can see there's different steps. For me, that looks like we start with getting new audience questions and creating a poll that we then post and tabulate results on. The episode then gets recorded and then edited. I write a script for it. Then we prep the file and we post it. And that is a process that has to repeat over and over. I also do live shows, which have a different production process. And that's why I have both of those workflows documented. So it's easy for me to kind of come in and drop new milestones in for the team to make sure shows get produced. So I have some years of digital project management experience from being an executive in the advertising industry, but something like Trello, anyone can use to lay out the steps of your production process and track them and project how long things take.
Wonderful, wonderful. So back to what you were discussing in terms of the first 6 weeks of being on iTunes, when you were in the mode of asking everyone that you could think of, it sounded like, to be a subscriber. Did you use social media to help building that, or did you really rely upon your own personal networking along with, the iTunes and Google search functions?
I used social media for sure. Ask Science Mike had the good fortune of the Liturgist podcast preceding it. The Liturgist podcast had the good fortune of Michael and I already having social media platforms to get it started. But yeah, if you've got a healthy social media presence, that's an incredible way to help accelerate your launch program and planning. If you're going to have guests, planning 4 really high profile guests for your first 6 weeks so that you tag them and get them to share their interview with their networks can help grow the program. I remember, we had Pete Enns and Rob Bell and Rachel Evans and some pretty big names right in the first few episodes, and that helped grow the program a lot. And if you've got a good email list, that can help too, because response rates and click rates in email tend to be higher than response rates and click rates in social media.
Yes, I think everyone that we've talked to would agree with you on that. But can you comment on what you have found, particularly kind of in that initial growth mode area, of what's most effective for you regarding social media?
Snippets of the show, like if you post a short YouTube video with your logo and some of the audio so we can get a preview, like in Twitter, on Facebook, that can be sticky. Quotes from the episode that were really resonant, laid out on an image for shareability can really help. pictures either you in the studio or press photos of you and your guest help. Anything that help you jump out from simple text on Facebook and Twitter help. Instagram is a challenge, so it's very visual, but it's hard to include links in Instagram, so you just have to do the link and profile thing. And I've typically found Instagram doesn't do a good job delivering traffic. But well-crafted audio snippets, photos, and quotes laid out as graphics to do really well on Facebook and on Twitter.
Super. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the publishing process that you used. So, for instance, did you go through an agent to get to a publisher? Did you consider self-publishing? Did instead, since you were kind of so well known because of your podcast platform, did you have publishers coming to approach you? Can you just talk about those aspects of it a little bit?
Yeah, I went with an agent. My original plan was to self-publish a book. But a friend of mine told me that with the platform I was building, uh, I might, be able to sell plenty of copies self-publishing, but it would help my platform to work with a traditional publisher, because of the retail distribution. That would help grow my speaking business just to have a book in bookstores. And the editorial support you get from a traditional publisher is incredible. My favorite thing about working with one of the big 5 publishers is working with a really great editorial team that can help me tighten up not just the paragraphs and sentences, but the entire scope of the book. I found that collaborating process to be really helpful. So I worked with an agent. The agent was probably willing to work with me primarily because of the podcast. And once we, I probably took 5 times as long to get my book proposal where I wanted it as a more experienced author would have. But once we had that book proposal, we had a really incredible response rate from publishers wanting the book. And I'm sure, that's overwhelmingly due to the podcast. And I have a very active speaking career. I do a pretty consistent 3 or 5 on the road dates a month, and publishers like to see that as well.
Can you tell us a little bit of preview in terms of what your upcoming speaking engagements are?
Gosh, there's so many that let me just drop on my website because I can't. I know I'm doing a talk at Google February 1st at Google's headquarters. I'll do the Century Club in San Francisco on the 2nd. I'll be in Fort Smith, Arkansas on the 5th. I'll be in Boise at Northwest Nazarene on the 15th. The Hawkins Road Festival on February 18th. Doing Ask Science Mike Live February 19th at Chapel Hill. It's just back to back to back all the time.
Excellent. Well, you're widely distributed in many forms. So speaking of which,
as an author, I think that's really, really critical to get that multiple touch points, multiple interaction points with an audience to build your platform.
I couldn't agree more. And also, what you mentioned earlier about, diversity in terms of your income forms, I think is really important. And obviously, your podcast has been lead generation in some sense for your speaking, for your book sales, et cetera, et cetera. Speaking of distribution, do you ever do like a video version of your podcasts and put them on YouTube, or is that just a crazy thing to do?
It's not a crazy thing to do. I know so much about audio and so little about video that I have stayed away from video. I've had some production companies shoot me. So I have a video series called The New Copernicans I was really involved in. I did some really great book trailers for my book that were video. That's something we've looked at. Michael and I both have a face for radio, and we like doing the audio thing. But I have seen video podcasts take off and do well. It's just there's so much. You're exponentially increasing the production requirements to do a good job.
I can certainly believe that. So just one last question. Is there anything you could tell us about any new books that you might be coming out with soon or later?
It'll be later. I'm talking with my publisher about the second book. We've been going back and forth on some outline level stuff. You will see another book, at least one more book from me, hopefully more than that. My next book, it's early to say too much, but it'll be looking at the brain and trying to answer the question, why do we do things we didn't mean or want to do? And understanding that through both neuroscience and cognitive science, as well as the example we see in the Christian faith.
Wow, that will really be interesting. I'm sure valuable for all of us to learn more about that. Well, Mike, this has really been wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us.